The next speaker is, you know, when you have rabbi and doctor, you don't know which to have first. Is it Dr. Rabbi or Rabbi Doctor? So it's both ways here, so I'll do it both ways. It's listed as Rabbi Richard Weiss, MD, and then it says Dr. Rabbi Richard Weiss. In the case of our rabbinical seminary, when we have a chaplain in the Army who's also a captain, you can imagine that the titles are much larger than the actual name themselves. Dr. Rabbi Richard Weiss received his smicha, his rabbinic ordination, from Yeshiva University, and is presently the rabbi of the West Side Jewish Center in Manhattan. He is also a licensed physician, having completed an internship in internal medicine at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. Rabbi Weiss has lectured widely in the field of Jewish bioethics. He is a contributing author of the book Be Faithful and Multiply by Dr. Richard Grazi. He also serves on a number of bioethics committees and is affiliated with the Department of Ethics at St. Vincent's Medical Center, and he lectures on many topics. And unlike the previous speaker, I do not know whether or not Rabbi Weiss voted for Ronald Reagan, but it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Rabbi Richard Weiss.
Can I move it? Can I just close this without tampering with your? I'm sorry. Just.
You should. Can you guys turn it off?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Furman. Thank you, Rabbi Spivak. I just wanted to also thank a few people, not to the exclusion of others, but those who I've interacted with directly, who have given me the honor to participate in this conference today. Dr. Kupfer, Dr. Ackerman, and of course Rochelle and Dina, and my close friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Reichman. Since I'm really a rabbi, although I received my medical degree before my rabbinic ordination, but since I practice primarily as a rabbi, and that's where my first love, in a sense, is, so I have to start with a story, of course. And the story is either apocryphal, anecdotal, or actually true. Apparently, when President Clinton was president, the premier of Japan was coming to visit President Clinton at the White House. And apparently, the premier of Japan was not very fluent at all in English. And so his advisors were instructing him how to greet President Clinton. They told him, when you meet President Clinton, just say to the president, "How are you?" And when he responds, "I'm fine," say, "Me too." So he's reviewing his lines, "How are you? Me too. How are you? Me too." A couple minutes before he's introduced to President Clinton, he gets a little unsettled, a little nervous. And as he is introduced to President Clinton, he says to the president, "Who are you?" To which the president responds, "I'm Hillary's husband." To which he responds, "Me too." For the next few minutes, I'd like to focus on the stem cell research that Dr. Furman delineated for you. And I think that two of the questions that I will try to resolve, or at least shed some light on, are questions on determining, regarding this stem cell, who are you, and perhaps even more importantly, how are you? And I'll explain that as we proceed. I do not plan to discuss cloning or somatic cell nuclear transfer. I also don't plan on discussing the other source of stem cells, namely from cadaveric fetuses that are aborted, that are now fetal cadavers, and deriving stem cells from those fetuses that are aborted in utero, which is another topic and another issue. I exclusively plan to discuss the issue of stem cell research derived from these excess or unnecessary or unneeded fertilized ovum in reproductive clinics, their status, their permissibility, or their prohibition. I also do not plan on discussing public policy regarding these issues, just to perhaps develop the ideas of permissibility versus prohibition. There are a number of very good articles on these issues. One article that appeared in the Rabbi Jacob Joseph Journal, co-authored by Dr. Rosner and by Rabbi Dr. Reichman. There's a recent article in Tradition Journal, authored, as he always eloquently and elaborately does, by Rabbi Dr. J. David Blythe. There are those articles that exist, and I suggest that if you're interested in stem cell research in particular, from the source of reproductive technology and excess in fertilized ovum in clinics, that you look at those articles. Elsewhere, Rabbi Blythe has an article where he talks about cadaveric fetal research and public policy, and a different article, and he references that in his article as well. What's interesting, though, is there are many more articles in the secular ethics field about stem cell research than there are in the Judaic field. This journal, the American Journal of Bioethics, has an issue dedicated exclusively. This is volume 2, number 1. This was just published a little while ago. This is from winter of 2002. It's exclusively dedicated to stem cell research. About a year and a half ago, the Hastings Center report was dedicated exclusively to stem cell research. There are articles and articles and articles. I have with me 2, not the complete collection, of the hearings of the subcommittee headed by the chairman, Arlen Specter, who heads the subcommittee that is responsible for overseeing and deliberating on stem cell research. It is fascinating, and Rabbi Blythe refers to this at the end of his article, that within the non-Jewish, if you will, bioethical world, there is a greater deliberation, greater preoccupation with stem cell research, its morality or its immorality. There are some very fascinating discussions, and again, if you're interested, there are websites and sources that you can look up on the hearings of under Senator Specter that are very fascinating to look at. There's even a fascinating doctor, I think Dr. Frank Young, who perhaps he patterned after me, who was a very highly successful MD, PhD, who now serves as a pastor, who testified in front of Arlen Specter's committee. So the fascinating thing about stem cell research is that apparently it's a much more significant issue amongst secular or other religions than it is within Judaism, just based on the literature. And I think that there's good reason for that. And that is that stem cell research from a Jewish perspective is not really new conceptually, no pun intended. The basic issues, and I will outline 5 basic issues regarding stem cell research, are not really new. These are old issues that are just reapplied to this new technology. We've addressed them before, perhaps with not complete resolution, and perhaps they need to be readdressed. But stem cell research is not a new concept in terms of its halachic or, if you will, religious, legal ramifications. Let me explain what I mean. 5 issues that I'd like to outline for you regarding stem cell research from a Jewish perspective. The first, for which I refer you to Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, is the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz from Great Britain, in his classic work on Jewish bioethics, entitled Jewish Bioethics. He has a section there where he talks about the concept of the entry of the soul into the body. And he talks about how in the Christian theology and Catholic theology, this was of great obsession, preoccupation. When does the soul enter the body? All kinds of opinions at the time of conception, time of birth, at 40 days for a male, 80 days for a female, commensurate with perhaps biblical sources in Leviticus, which talk about the difference between a woman who delivers a male or a female, 40 days, 80 days. All kinds of issues, and the importance of the entry of the soul into the body from a Catholic or Christian perspective is, of course, the issue of abortion. Because if the soul has entered the body at conception, well, then abortion is a problem. If it enters later on at delivery, at parturition, then it's less of a problem. If it enters at day 40 or 80, then it is less of a problem to perform an abortion in the very, very early stages. So abortion was considered to be somewhat pivotal on this point of when the soul enters the body. In Talmudic and rabbinic literature, the issue of the entry of the soul into the body probably encompasses about 5-6 lines. and that's about it. It's not that important for us when the soul enters the body or when the moment the soul exits the body. From a Jewish perspective, the importance is what a person does with one's life in between those 2 points, not what happens at those particular milestones. The Talmud talks about, as Rabbi Jacobowitz quotes, that's a Talmudic passage in Maseches Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin, where the issue wasn't even raised by a Jew. It was raised by a Roman emperor, Antoninus, where Antoninus asked Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, his close friend, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the codifier and the compiler of the Talmud, when does the soul enter the body? And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi gave him at first the wrong answer, because then Antoninus argued with him, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, you're probably right, I was wrong initially. The issue wasn't considered to be so important when the soul enters the body. And the discussion is at the time of Yitzira, at the time of advanced development of the fetus, when, as Rashi comments there in the Talmudic passage in Sanhedrin, when there's already bony structure, musculature in the fetus, a very fairly advanced stage of uterine development, intrauterine development, or Mishas Pekida, which has different translations as well, from the time of conception, time of implantation. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wasn't quite sure himself. He gave Antoninus, the Roman emperor, one answer, and the Roman emperor didn't like that answer, and so Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi backtracked. Talmud has elsewhere that the neshama, that the soul enters the body at day 40, because at day 40, as Dr. Furman just illustrated for you, day 40 is approximately the day at which a discernible embryo that resembles a human being in basic morphology and shape begins to be evident, and before that it's not considered Yitzira. Those are a few Talmudic passages, and that's it. And it's not really that important, as Rabbi Jacobowitz so eloquently points out in his classic treatise, which was his PhD thesis in the 1950s, which he converted into the classic book Jewish Bioethics. And that is that from a Jewish perspective, when the issue of abortion is raised, there isn't a discussion about when the soul enters the body. Abortion is permitted or not permitted based on more, if you will, academic or intellectual discussions, detailed legal debates, but not so much when the soul enters the body or not. It may reflect that ultimately in some form or fashion, but we can't empirically determine when the soul enters the body. Clearly, God was not particularly concerned whether we should know such information or not, otherwise he would have made it readily available and discernible for us. And therefore, from a Jewish perspective, the issue of the soul entering the body is not particularly important. It's interesting philosophically. It has perhaps some ramifications in other concepts. That's the famous discussion that the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, in the very beginning of Tanya quotes a brisa, quotes that rabbinic passage from the Tractate Nida, which talks about the fact that in utero the angel teaches every fetus as it is developing the entirety of the Torah. That may or may not correspond with the entry of the soul into the body, perhaps not. By the way, a story that Rabbi Schechter always likes to tell us at Yeshiva University is that when Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory was growing up in Europe, so one of his first teachers, he had a private tutor, was a Lubavitcher Chassid. And this Lubavitcher Chassid was instructed by Rabbi Soloveitchik's father, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, to teach Rabbi Soloveitchik Talmud. But instead of doing that, he decided to teach Rabbi Soloveitchik Tanya. I don't think that employment lasted very long, but because of that exposure to Tanya, Rabbi Soloveitchik became very, very enthralled and enamored with Tanya and with Lubavitch in general, and has entire theses developed on that statement in the Talmud that is the beginning of the book of Sefer Tanya, talking about, the Rabbi Soloveitchik has elaborate discussions about the significance of that statement, that in utero every fetus is taught the entirety of Torah. That aside, the issue of the entry of the soul into the body from a Jewish perspective is irrelevant for our discussion. Also irrelevant to our discussion is probably the issue of what Rabbi Blythe refers to as subvisual or microscopic elements in nature. At the point at which a pre-embryo is implanted in a woman for purposes of in vitro fertilization and reimplantation, that 4 to 8 cell stage pre-embryo is microscopic. And if you don't implant, as Dr. Furman detailed for you, if you allow that to go to a developmental stage of 5-6 days, then you develop a blastocyst with the inner cell mass, which contains perhaps up to 100 cells, but that structure is microscopic. And so the issue becomes, one of the issues, and Rabbi Bleich has a long discussion about this in his article, the issue becomes, is an entity which is microscopic, from which you want to derive stem cells from the inner cell mass, and in so doing destroy the basic conceptus, potential conceptus, destroy that blastocyst or that preembryo, is something that is microscopic and not visual to the naked eye, cannot be detected by normal human senses. Is that something that one has to worry about from a halachic perspective? We know that there is tremendous precedent for this concept. Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Auerbach, they all discuss the fact that we don't need to worry about microscopic creatures that exist in the water or in the air, even though there is a prohibition by the Bible to ingest non-kosher creatures and insects, but microscopic creatures in water, microscopic creatures flying around in the form of bacteria and other in the air are not things that we need to be worried about. The classic application has to do with the phylacteries, the tefillin that we wear on a daily basis. The phylacteries have to be square boxes, and Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Auerbach, all the classical contemporary decisors point out that one doesn't have to take a magnifying glass or any kind of visual aid to determine whether the squaring of the boxes is truly square or whether there is some rounding there, because one just has to and is only obligated to rely on one's naked eye, one's normal human senses. Anything that is microscopic or not sensed by human senses is not considered to be significant in terms of Jewish law, and therefore the argument is perhaps made that since these structures from which we are deriving stem cells are microscopic at this point of their development, we need not worry about them. That's a point that is somewhat cogent, except for the fact that the easy argument is that that concept, which is an idea that I think Rabbi Auerbach makes, as quoted by Rabbi Neuwirth in another context, that concept only applies to an entity that is from its beginning to end microscopic in nature. These little small microscopic creatures in water live out their entire life cycle as microscopic entities. They never develop into macroscopic structures. They never become able to be visualized, as opposed to an developing embryo fetus. At some point, this entity, which began as a microscopic entity, becomes macroscopic. So it's not plausible, probably, it's not plausible to argue that something that begins microscopic but will eventually become macroscopic, while it is microscopic, it is considered insignificant and you can do with it what you wish, but at the point that it becomes macroscopic, all of a sudden it gains a certain significance. Something that is always microscopic is always microscopic and insignificant. Something that goes through a developmental stage from microscopy to macroscopy is not something that one can just disregard. Number two, the truth of the matter is that a pre-embryo, or even at the point that the embryo is developing and still microscopic, it's not true that it's not able to be detected by human senses. When a woman misses her expected menstrual period, by definition, she's considered to be pregnant until proven otherwise. So the fact that she's able to detect through normal senses, namely the lack of menstrual flow, that she may be pregnant is perhaps considered to be significant enough to determine that that pregnancy is not insignificant. Even if I can't visualize it, but I can detect it through other means. One could perhaps even argue that a dipstick in urine for pregnancies test, which is something I can visualize changes, is perhaps also something detectable, but that's also open to argumentation. So we're not going to use that as a source of permissibility. Another factor, which is also probably not categorically one that one can use to categorically permit stem cell research, again from these stem cells that are derived from unneeded or extra pre-embryos developed in vitro through fertilization of the ovum with the sperm and developed to a stage of 5-6 days and then are going to be either discarded or continue to be frozen in liquid nitrogen or used by other couples, then another argument that can probably not be used, although it is used by many, is the issue of the fact that all of this occurs within the first 40 days of what would normally be development or gestation. We know that there is an issue regarding abortion in Judaism. And abortion in Judaism, unlike abortion in the Catholic religion, is something which is much more hotly debated and much less unequivocal, and not completely resolved in terms of what the nature of the prohibition is. It is almost unanimously agreed upon that abortion is prohibited, but what the nature and severity of abortion in terms of the prohibition is not uniformly agreed upon. Anywhere from murder to, as Dr. Steinberg so encyclopedic in his tradition, in his classic work, which won him the Israel Prize, points out in his section on Hapolas Ubarim, on abortion, where he collects the various opinions and the gamut of the various views on what the nature of the prohibition of abortion is, anywhere from murder to chavola, to considering to be injuring the woman or the developing fetus, to hashchas hazera, wasting of seed, various opinions he goes into, Dr. Steinberg does, with his presence being noted, the details of all of those issues. What is also of significant contention is what is the status of a pre-embryo or an embryo within the first 40 days. Many commentators point out that the Talmud describes the first 40 days of gestation. And let me just point out that means the first 40 days of gestation, not the first 40 days of clinical pregnancy, which is dated from the last menstrual period, but first 40 days of gestation, which would approximately be 2 weeks after the last menstrual period, approximately. So the first 40 days of gestation, the Talmud has a description that the fetus or the pre-embryo or embryo is described as maya ba'alma, just mere water. So many commentators, both contemporary and more remote, are of the opinion that that statement implies that a developing embryo within the first 40 days, which is what we're talking about something after 5-6 days of development, where it is clearly within the first 40 days of development of potential gestation, that those first 40 days, the pre-embryo has no halachic, no religious significance, or much less significance than any other time of pregnancy, and therefore the prohibition of abortion may not apply at all, or if it does apply, it's much less severe during the first 40 days, because the Talmud uses the description regarding the first 40 days of gestation that the embryo is maya ba'alma, just mere water. And that does, by the way, serve as one of the basis for a statement by the Beth Din of America, which is the halachic or legal arm of the Rabbinical Council of America, of which I am a card-carrying member. With that introduction, I will now disagree with one of their statements, but just to point out that this isn't because of anything political. I happen to be a card-carrying member. In fact, I just spoke to Rabbi Dworkin just the other day, the executive vice president. So I'm a proud member of the Rabbinical Council of America, but for academic purposes, I will engage their statement and contend that it may not be completely accurate. In a statement issued by Rabbinical Council of America, Beth Din of America, they make the following statement regarding stem cell research. Halakha, or Jewish law, does not consider any embryonic development within 40 days of conception as having the sacred protected status of a human being. Therefore, the use of embryos for stem cell research is not considered an act of destruction of life. This use of the embryo does not come under any category of abortion that would be applicable after 40 days of conception, which after 40 days of conception is forbidden by Jewish law or halacha, unless, of course, the mother's life is in danger. Consequently, in view of the possible, very positive results of stem cell research for the cure of various diseases, it is not only permitted, but it is an imperative to support and proceed with this field of science. This was dated August 21st of last year. I would respectfully submit that that statement needs to be perhaps readdressed, because the fact of the matter is that if you look carefully at the Talmudic passages that describe the pre-embryo or embryo within the first 40 days of gestation as maya ba'alma, as mere water, you will find nowhere that the Talmud applies or extrapolates that principle to the issue of abortion. This is a point that is described and discussed in detail by Rabbi Feinstein, where he is very, very hesitant about allowing abortions for Jews and perhaps even non-Jews, but certainly for Jews during the first 40 days. The Talmudic passage is very fascinating, so I'll just briefly refer to it. The Talmudic passage talks about the fact, one of the passages that talk about this concept of maya ba'alma, mere water, being the status of the embryo within the first 40 days, is a passage that talks about the fact that we know that Kohanim, priests, which is, by the way, another issue of genetics in terms of determining Kohanic or priestly status. I believe Dr. Bennett gave a lecture on that talk in a different context, where a Kohen, a priest, is permitted to eat truma, given certain tithes from grains and produce that the non-Kohanim give as gifts to the priest because of the work that they serve in the temple. Well, the Talmud talks about what if you have a bas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen. Well, the daughter of a Kohen, like any other family member, is permitted to partake of that truma as well, those priestly gifts. But the Talmud describes that if she marries out of the priestly family, she marries a non-Kohen, which she's certainly permitted to do, she loses the privilege of eating from the truma because she's now part of a non-Kohen family. So the Talmud describes, well, what happens if she doesn't marry somebody, but she has a relationship? She lives with a non-Kohen. So the Talmud describes that Yisrael Shaba al Bas Kohen, this is a Talmudic passage in the tractate Yevamos. If a Yisrael Shaba al Bas Kohen, if a non-Kohen lives with a daughter of a Kohen, Tochal b'truma, she's still permitted to go home and eat truma. That's assuming her parents allow her back into the house. Her biggest problem in life is not the fact whether she can eat truma. She has other issues that she's going to have to deal with back home. But assuming they let her back in, so is she allowed to eat truma? So the Mishnah says yes, because she didn't marry the other person. She simply lived with him. Ibra, however, if she conceived from that relationship, once she conceives, she's not permitted to eat truma. Once she is pregnant, she can't eat truma anymore. So the Talmud says, well, you're not going to know right away whether she's pregnant or not. It's going to take a little while. The Talmud talks about 3 months. Talk about the concept of hukar ubara, the recognizable discernment of pregnancy. The Talmud says, what are you going to do until then? So every time, it didn't happen that often, every time a daughter of a Kohen lives with a non-Kohen, the potential of pregnancy is there. So until we determine that she is or is not pregnant, she should not be permitted to eat truma because we don't have all the facts. Says the Talmud, yes and no. During the first 40 days, says the Talmud, we don't care what she is. Even if she's pregnant, says the Talmud, that pregnancy is maya ba'alma, mere water. And therefore it is not considered to be significant from this perspective, and therefore she is permitted to eat truma regardless. After 40 days, you're right, we'll have to be worried until she can determine whether or not she is pregnant or not. Rashi there comments what is the significance of 40 days, as he points out, based on Talmudic passages elsewhere. That's Yitziras Havlad Arboim Yom, that the formation, the initial formation of a discernible embryo that resembles a human being takes about 40 days, and therefore until that time, the pregnancy is maya ba'alma, mere water. To extrapolate from that and automatically assume that therefore the pregnancy is considered to be inconsequential not only for purposes of this particular law of eating truma or not, but even for purposes of abortion, is not automatically linked by the Talmud. That's an extrapolation. Perhaps it's a correct extrapolation, but it's not explicit. And Rabbi Feinstein very, very strongly and very vehemently in his responsa talks about the fact that we know, the way we assume, based on writings of one of the famous rabbinic physicians of all time, the Ramban Nachmanides, where the Nachmanides quotes from earlier sources that if a woman on Yom Kippur or a woman on Shabbat is facing the possibility of losing her pregnancy, then we violate the Sabbath, we violate Yom Kippur, we violate what we need to save that pregnancy, even if you could construe a clinical scenario where her life is not in danger, it is exclusively the danger to the embryo or fetus, and even within the first 40 days. even within the first 40 days. So Rabbi Feinstein, based on previous authorities as well, makes the following statement. He says, it's incomprehensible to me, he says, that you can violate the Sabbath, you can violate Yom Kippur, you can violate anything you need to save a pregnancy within the first 40 days, and yet the day after Yom Kippur, if you want to, you can just destroy that embryo at will, wantonly, with just willy-nilly. He says it's incomprehensible that you can be obligated and permitted and obligated to violate the Sabbath, violate Yom Kippur, to save a pregnancy within the first 40 days, and then you can go around and tell me that I'm allowed to destroy that embryo within the first 40 days. So he thinks that that's not conceivable, although he doesn't come to a definitive prohibition against it, and he discusses it, but he leans towards that view. The point being that it is not so easy to simply disregard the issue of the stem cells that are derived from the early gestational ages of 5-6 days, the blastocyst and the inner cell mass, because of the issue of the fact that they're very early in their development, the first 40 days. That's something that is not agreed upon by everyone, and it perhaps is not sufficient reason to allow stem cell research. The primary reason, however, to allow stem cell research is the following argument, and that is, and let me quote to you some of the classical contemporary opinions, which again had nothing to do with stem cell research. They had to do with questions that were posed largely by Dr. Richard Grazi and others to rabbis in Israel regarding the issues of what do you do before stem cell research came up. What do you do with extra fertilized eggs in vitro clinics? What do you do with them? They're in liquid nitrogen. Do you have to keep them there forever and ever in the liquid nitrogen? Can you discard them? Can you destroy them? So two of the very, very prominent rabbinic decisors in Israel to whom Dr. Grazi posed these questions, one was the former Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, and one was Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu has the following very cryptic, very brief address of this issue, and he says the following: Kol ha-beitziot hamufarot, all of the eggs that have been fertilized, ha'amurot lihiyot mushtolot berechem hoem, which have been designated and labeled for purposes of reimplantation into the woman's uterus, ein lahashmidon, you shouldn't destroy them. If they've been designated to be reimplanted, then you can't destroy them if for some reason there's a change in that decision. That change may be based on a similar case, on a case that occurred many years ago in the state of Israel, the Nachmani case, where there was a couple that was involved in more, it was more than just in vitro fertilization. It was in vitro fertilization with a surrogate mother in California. But then the Nachmanis separated and they became divorced, and there were issues in terms of what to do with their fertilized egg. One wanted to go ahead with the procedure, one didn't. Complicated case. So, ein lashmidan, if they've been designated for reimplantation, you cannot destroy them. Kivan sha'asid latseis mehen uberchai, since they are destined to allow the development from them of a live fetus or baby. Avol, he says, habeitziot, the eggs, shalom nivcharu lihashtalel, that have not been chosen or selected for purposes of reimplantation, mutar lezorkum, you're permitted to throw those away and discard them, and certainly therefore to use them for stem cell research. Ve'en bezen afkamina ben Yehudim legoyim, makes no difference whether the patients or the people involved are Jewish or not Jewish. He doesn't really explain, he doesn't really flesh out why it is that he feels, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, that there's a difference between those that have been designated and those that have not yet been designated. I'd like to suggest an explanation perhaps at the end, but he doesn't clearly define his reason. Rabbi Chaim David Halevi gives a different reason. He points out that the reason of within 40 days is not a good enough reason. He points that out himself explicitly. But he says in response to Dr. Grazi, first he addresses the basic issue of assisted reproductive technology, which he himself is not comfortable with. But he says, of course, you, Dr. Grazi, live in a major center of very religious Jews in New York, and obviously you have accepted those views of the rabbis who allow assisted reproductive technology, so I'm not addressing that issue, an issue that I'm not comfortable discussing in general, he says. However, regarding the question that you specifically asked me, what do you do with the excess fertilized eggs, he says, mutur lezorkon, you're permitted to destroy them or discard discard them. Im lo nivcharu lahashtalah, just like Rabbi Mordechai Leo, if they have not been chosen for reimplantation. B'shum she'ein din hapala, but he explains a little bit more the reasoning. B'shum she'ein din hapala el merechem isha dafka, because abortion can only be considered abortion if it occurs within the context of a uterus, that one is destroying the fetus or embryo within the uterine cavity, not something ex utero, not something outside of the uterus. And that seems to be the major reason. The reason for that, which is an idea that Rabbi Bleich quotes from Rabbi Sternbach as well, and that is that if you compare or contrast a developing embryo or fetus in utero to a developing pre-embryo in vitro or ex utero, there's a fundamental difference between the two. The number one fundamental difference is one has potential viability and one has zero potential viability. Any developing embryo or fetus, until a spontaneous or other activity occurs within the uterus, has potential viability. It's an idea Rabbi Feinstein develops as well within the first 40 days as well. That potential viability is enough to create the prohibition against abortion for whatever the reason abortion is prohibited. But an ex utero stem cell within a blastocyst in the inner cell mass of a developing 5 to 6 day old fertilized ovum in vitro has absolutely zero potential viability as it exists now, unless a human being actively intervenes and implants it into a uterus. That not being the case, under normal situations, it has zero potential. And therefore, because of its zero potential, it is not considered to be a viable, at all potential viable creature of any kind of living status. And therefore, one is permitted to destroy it at will. That still doesn't explain why those that have been designated for reimplantation are not, and those that are not, we'll come back to that in a moment. Just to, as I'm beginning to wrap up, just to point out one of the interesting facts that the American Journal of Bioethics points out is that if you look at the first Encyclopedia Britannica, published in the 1700s, defines embryo, as it spelled it then, E-M-B-R-I-O, as, quote, the first rudiments of an animal in the womb, before the several members are distinctly formed, after which period it is denominated a fetus. That idea of within the womb seems to be an idea again. When I first was exposed to the issue of stem cell research, I had the privilege of listening to Dr. Steinberg, who lectured at a synagogue in Queens. And Dr. Steinberg kept on re-emphasizing the point that the verse, the pasuk in Bereshis and Genesis, which is the source for abortion, talks about the idea of shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishofech, which literally means that if a human being kills another human being, that human being will be put to death by other man. Ba'adam damo yishofech. He will be put to death, capital punishment, by a court. But the Talmud describes, bothered by the syntax and the particular language of the verse, that it also refers to Adam ba'Adam, a human being within another human being. What kind of human being lives within another human being? We know that kangaroos can live within the pockets of other kangaroos, but what kind of human being lives within a human being? That's an embryo or a fetus. That's Adam ba'Adam, and the verse says that that kind of action of murdering a human being within a human being is prohibited. The idea behind that is presumably this idea that Rabbi Sternbach and the others developed, that the only time a human being has potential viability is when he or she is contained within a uterine environment, with the amniotic sac and the entire milieu that allows the developing embryo fetus to gain viability. Ex utero, there's no amniotic sac, there's no uterine lining, there are no hormones, there isn't anything to allow for potential viability, and therefore presumably not of significance, and therefore presumably permitted to discard. The only problem is, why do these rabbinic deciders seem to distinguish between those stem cells or those eggs that have been designated for reimplantation as opposed to the ones that have not? We're not talking, most of the research that we're talking about are those that were going to be discarded, not that those who were going to be reimplanted, because those by and large are used for reimplantation, but those that have not been chosen. So perhaps the reason is, and for the fifth issue, and that is the question of Hashkas Zera, something that Rabbi Shmuel Halevi Vozner addresses in a response to Rabbi Friedlander, who was the supervisor of Dr. Grazi, rabbinic supervisor of Dr. Grazi's reproductive clinic in Maimonides, affiliated with Maimonides, Genesis Fertility, where Rabbi Vozner responds also, not seemingly bothered by the discarding of these pre-embryos, but raises the issue and does not answer it definitively regarding perhaps the possibility of hashchas hazera. Maybe it's not considered abortion per se, or at least not on the severe levels, but maybe it's no less than wasting seed. If a person is not permitted to waste seed, to waste sperm, perhaps not to waste eggs, different question. One is not permitted to waste a fertilized egg. That could be no less severe, presumably, than wasting seed. And isn't that a problem if you waste it? Now, you could argue that that's not wasting, because it's being used for research that eventually may have very significant both research and clinical applications. One could argue that's not wasting. On the other hand, one could argue that it can only be used for reproductive technology, otherwise it's considered wasting. One could only argue that the sperm and cells have already been retrieved and developed, and the issue of wasting is no longer relevant ex utero. Those are all issues, but perhaps, without going into great detail regarding that, and just as I wind up in the next 1 minute, perhaps that's what Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu and Chaim David Halevi were thinking, that fertilized eggs that have been designated for reimplantation, to waste them, to destroy them, would be a real hashchas hazera, wasting of seed, because they've been designated for that purpose, not abortion, but wasting of seed. As opposed to those that were not chosen, they're considered to be non-viable, and therefore there's nothing to discuss. They weren't destined to be used for fertilization or reproduction, and therefore there's no wasting of seed. That's a suggestion. So the 5 issues that we discussed, just to wrap up and just to conclude with one final thought, and that is the issue of the entry of the soul into the body, which is very fascinating, but we felt irrelevant. The issue of the subvisual or microscopic nature of the entities we're talking about, again fascinating, but probably irrelevant. The issue of within the first 40 days, perhaps more relevant, but not categorically applicable. The fourth, the most important issue, being that of the non-viability of these entities without any human intervention, that being the most important. And the fifth, the issue of the wasting of the seed, which is perhaps less clear, at least to myself at this point. Just to conclude, there's a famous comment of one of the Hasidic Rebbes, the Ger Rebbe. I forget, I believe it was either the first one, the Chidushei Harim, Rav Yitzchak Meir, or the Sfas Emes. And he's quoted as saying that the verse that we recite during the recitation of the Hallel, that we recite on holidays, that Hashemayim Shemayim LaHashem, V'ha'aretz Nosan Livnei Adam, that the heavens are the heavens to God, that's His domain, V'ha'aretz Nosan Livnei Adam, and God has given earth for man, that is our domain. Says the Ger Rebbe, I believe it was the Chidushei Harim, says the Ger Rebbe that's a mistranslation of that verse. The verse doesn't mean to tell us that God's domain is in heaven and man's domain is on earth. On the contrary, what the verse means to tell us is Hashemayim Shemayim LaHashem. Heaven is God's domain, and God gave man earth so that man may transform earth into heaven. That's the purpose of earth, to transform it into heaven. And all of the discussions that Dr. Furman and myself and that you will hear throughout the day are designed for that purpose, that we live on this earth not simply for earth's sake, but for the purpose of transforming earth into heaven. And as a result, everything that we do, whether we agree or disagree on how to proceed with stem cell, is an accomplishment and fulfillment of transforming heaven into earth.